With me today is Norm Gaum, who is the former director of the Interstate Stream Commission and project director of the Gila Wild Defense Fund. I also have Dan Hallam, who is a civil rights attorney in Santa Fe. Welcome to you both.
Glad to be here.
Glad to be here, Gwyneth.
Thanks for coming in. Norm, we've been talking for a long time about whether to divert the Gila River to pull some water out, but this in some ways feels very far from us here in Albuquerque. What stake do people in southeastern New Mexico have that we share up here in the rest of the state?
Well, I think there's several values. One of the first would be wise use of public funds. A second would be why ruin a wonderful wild place that was adjacent to the first wilderness set aside in the nation for a project that won't work. The state would propose to basically destroy a good portion of the wild upper Gila Box Canyon immediately downstream from the wilderness to take water out, but there's not much water. The cost is over the top, and they're not telling the truth about it.
It's interesting, I was just down in the Gila Wilderness earlier in last year, and it is extremely remote. There are so few people down there. How can you characterize the water needs of that area that would hypothetically be met by a diversion project?
Well, one of the bizarre elements of the state's planning is they've been unable to identify a real need for the water. Certainly nobody who can pay for it. Silver City, which is the largest community that's close to it, has always said they don't want to participate. Deming says that they want the water, but more recent conversations indicate that they think the costs are just insane and that there's no way. Freeport-McMoRan, one of the world's largest mining companies, is behind the scenes there somewhere in a way that's not transparent. We don't understand. So it's very unclear who needs and who wants the water.
Are you saying the mining companies want the water?
Well, it's interesting. The very first official meeting I had as ISC director in 1997 was with Phelps Dodge, who was subsequently acquired by Freeport-McMoRan, who told me that they were interested in developing the Gila River water and they wanted to lease it for use in Arizona.
Last year, you sued the Interstate Stream Commission, your former employer, for violating the state's Open Meetings Act. What evidence do you have that they broke the law?
Well, the evidence is pervasive. I studiously avoided dealing with Gila River issues since I left the Interstate Stream Commission as its director at the end of 2002. It wasn't my business, it was my successor's business, and I just stayed out of it. But enough people expressed concern to me late in 2013 that I thought that I would look into it. I went to one Interstate Stream Commission meeting December of 2013, and the proceedings on the Gila were just bizarre. I had meetings. I could make a long story out of this. I won't. I thought at first that they just needed some help with the facts, and that if the facts came out that they would make the correct decision. But as time rolled on, with many engagements in the early part of 2014, it became apparent to me that the facts mattered nothing to them. In fact, they wanted to suppress the facts.
But were they meeting in secret? Were they keeping the public out?
At that December meeting that I went to, they reconstituted their Gila committee, which consisted of 4 people. And at many meetings of full open public meetings with the commission, the Gila committee would report. The report was always very short, just cursory. They would identify the topics they discussed.
But if a committee doesn't have decision-making power, their meetings don't have to be open.
Well, if they are forming public policy and guiding staff and deciding how to respond, for example, to criticism like mine, which they never did in an open public meeting. In other words, everything stays in the committee. It doesn't get reported out. There's no actions in an open public meeting. That's a violation of the law. And when I finally figured that out, particularly at their August meeting this year, where their behavior was just unbelievable to me, I consulted with an attorney and ended up giving them a notice that I intended to sue in September.
Dan, now he did sue, and now they're suing him, which is where you come in. The Interstate Stream Commission essentially says that Norm was just trying to make them miss their deadline. He was meddling and just trying to interfere, and you are representing him on behalf of the American Civil Liberties Union, New Mexico. You are also no stranger to the Open Meetings Act. You've been a legal advisor to the Foundation for Open Government, where I used to work. Is it unusual for the government to turn around and sue someone who's suing them?
It is extremely unusual, and it is a terrible attack on democracy for this state agency to attack a citizen who is trying to vindicate his rights under the Open Meetings Act. We have two basic transparency laws in New Mexico, the Open Meetings Act and the Inspection of Public Records Act. And for an agency to turn around and countersue for hundreds of thousands of dollars of damages that they're alleging, which I don't think they're going to be able to prove anyway. But the business of a state agency is to make policy decisions, allocate money in a transparent and open manner. And if they're not doing that and they get called to the carpet for not doing that, then that is not something that should be the basis of a lawsuit by them.
A government agency that has a firm deadline with the federal government and has to proceed in a timely fashion can feel very interrupted by someone who is on the line between whistleblower and gadfly, shall we say.
Let's be clear about something. At least in newspaper reports, the Interstate Stream Commission has said that they're not contesting Mr. Gom's right to have brought a suit under the Open Meetings Act. They're contesting his obtaining a temporary restraining order against them, which slowed down their process. But Mr. Gom did not issue the temporary restraining order. That was issued by a state district judge in Santa Fe. And for them to now be attacking him because of something a judge did is entirely inappropriate.
Well, he did ask the judge to do it, so why are they suing him? I mean, why, what is the purpose? They met the deadline.
Yes, it all came out in the end for the way they wanted it, and my feeling is that they are now attempting to punish Mr. Gom for exercising his rights under the Open Meetings Act. This is, in the legal parlance, a strategic litigation against public participation, a SLAPP suit. It's a kind of lawsuit which is usually filed by the powerful against people who don't have much power and who have exercised their right to petition the government, either by coming to a city council meeting and speaking out, or in this case, filing a lawsuit, another way of petitioning the government. And they are turning around and trying to chill the exercise of these rights by Mr. Gom and, in my opinion, by other citizens in the state. And for this government, the government of the state of New Mexico, to be doing this is, in my opinion, not only unprecedented, but it is also an outrageous violation of our citizens' rights. And it's a very dangerous thing for a government to be doing.
Norm, speaking of public participation, we just, in the past few weeks here, have seen school board elections in New Mexico where not a single person showed up to vote, not even the people running for the school board. Public participation is at an all-time low. Are people really that worked up about this? Were they really wanting to go to these meetings and participate?
Well, public participation is hard. People have lives. The meetings are scheduled in the daytime. One of the things the Interstate Stream Commission has done is to make it difficult for people to participate. For example, they held a meeting on November 10th after the temporary restraining order was lifted to hear from their consultants who gave them these trumped up reports justifying the diversion with no opportunity for public comment. The public comment was scheduled in Silver City 4 days later. I happened to go down and provide public comment. Was there any response to that? Any acknowledgement? No, just really pretty much rude behavior on the part of the ISC.
Dan, if this lawsuit is successful against Norm here, what do you think the effect would be on public participation in meetings like this in the future in New Mexico?
Well, I think that the Open Meetings Act is important not merely because it would allow a lot of people to attend a meeting. It's important even if one person attends the meeting, because then the information gets out, the newspapers cover it, and many, many more people can know. That's how we watch our government. It doesn't depend on a crowd showing up. It depends on there being open government that can be watched by anybody. And the consequence, I think, of this lawsuit could be that people will not be a watchdog on what their government is doing, and if they see that the government is meeting secretly, they would be frightened. They wouldn't bring a lawsuit like this because of the risk that they might get sued in the process. Interestingly, the Open Meetings Act and the Inspection of Public Records Act both have an attorney's fees provision, which is meant to encourage people to bring these kinds of lawsuits so long as they're not frivolous. And Mr. Gom's suit was certainly not frivolous. And so I'm worried, and that's why the ACLU has gotten involved in this, because the citizens' rights to speak out through the court process to make sure that government is following the law will be seriously chilled, if not the door shut, as a result.
Norm, we have just a little bit less than a minute left. If this project goes forward and the state proceeds to move ahead with damming this river and diverting the water in whatever ways, who will win and who will lose?
Well, who will win? The consultants and the contractors will win big. One of the things I object to most is the secretive handing out of millions of dollars of contracts for studies that really have bogus premises, and can't be productive. But that seems to me to be one of the driving forces, is money flowing to consultants and contractors. The people who will lose will be the people who are expecting water but either can't afford it or it won't be there for them. And the people who have to pay the bill, which is likely to be you and me, everybody in the state, because this could not be built without massive state government subsidies. The federal money to build it is extremely limited, and the chances of more federal money flowing to this are extremely low.
Norm Gom, Daniel Hallam, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Gwen.
Thank you, Gwyneth. Good to see you.